The courtroom was packed that cold winter morning. As the clock ticked steadily, Officer Derek Malone stepped forward with a stiff posture and an expression full of disdain. His reputation on the force was built on a legacy of aggressive tactics and unspoken bias, and today he believed he was about to prove himself once again. Across the room sat Marcia Ellis, a woman whose calm demeanor and quiet strength had made her a respected community advocate for years. Today, she was on trial as a witness in a case that had already drawn whispers and raised eyebrows. Officer Malone, whose uniform was as crisp as his opinions, took the stand with a sneer. His voice boomed as he recounted events from the previous night, claiming that Marcia had incited a disturbance during a community protest. Every word he spoke was laced with a tone that hinted at prejudice, an arrogance that assumed guilt without evidence. His testimony was meant to cast doubt on her integrity, to paint her as a troublemaker in a community he felt was out of place. Marcia sat quietly, her eyes never leaving the officer. There was no sign of fear in her. Instead, her calm was almost defiant. The air was thick with tension as the first few questions from the prosecutor began. But something was off. As Malone continued to speak, subtle contradictions appeared in his story. His details did not match the facts, and his voice wavered slightly when pressed for specifics. In that charged moment, a murmur of confusion spread among the spectators. Questions began to form in the minds of everyone present. Was the officer's testimony as solid as he believed? Could it be that his personal biases had twisted the truth? Without warning, the atmosphere shifted. The seed of doubt had been planted. In the silence that followed Malone's next statement, it was clear that the courtroom was holding its breath. Everyone could sense that the case was about to take an unexpected turn, a turn that might expose more than just a flawed testimony. The tension was palpable, and the viewer is left wondering what hidden truths lie beneath the surface. The stakes were rising, and as the day progressed, it would become evident that the truth would not remain buried for long. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching from. For our returning subscribers, thank you so much for your unwavering support. It truly means a lot to our community. Northbridge Municipal Courthouse was a stately building, its marble floors and high ceilings echoing decades of legal tradition. Within these walls, justice was meant to be blind, fair, and unwavering. On this day, however, a case had drawn attention not merely for its legal implications, but for the deep undercurrents it exposed about bias and authority. Officer Derek Malone was a figure who had served on the force for over 20 years. He was known for his stern approach and for an uncompromising belief in his own way of maintaining order. His uniform was impeccable, his boots polished, and his eyes carried a hardness that suggested he had little patience for what he deemed disorder. Yet behind that rigid exterior lay a man whose worldview was marred by prejudices, views that had been silently nurtured over the years by an environment that rarely questioned authority. In stark contrast was Marcia Ellis. In her early 40s, Marcia was a pillar of the community. Born and raised in Northbridge, she had witnessed firsthand the struggles of a marginalized population. Over the years, she had become an outspoken advocate for civil rights and social justice, fighting tirelessly for the underdog. Her reputation as a fair, honest, and kind person had spread far and wide, earning her the respect of those who knew her and even admiration from unexpected quarters. Today, her calm presence in the courtroom was both a shield and a challenge to the forces that sought to discredit her. The courthouse itself was a blend of old-world elegance and modern functionality. Sunlight filtered through tall stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the polished floors. Rows of wooden benches were filled with citizens, legal professionals, and media representatives, all eager to witness a case that promised to be much more than a legal formality. Outside, the city of Northbridge buzzed with life, a community grappling with change, where old beliefs often clashed with new ideas. The case at hand was not simply about a single incident. It was about the clash between tradition and progress, between an officer's unchecked authority and a community's demand for justice. Behind closed doors, the internal affairs of the police department had long been under scrutiny, with whispers of misconduct and bias echoing in hushed tones. Today, the courtroom was set to become a battleground where those issues would be laid bare. The tension in the room was further heightened by the fact that this trial was being closely watched by both local media and civil rights activists. Every detail, from the expressions on the faces of the jury members to the body language of the legal teams, was under scrutiny. It was a moment when every word, every gesture carried immense weight. Marcia Ellis had come not only to defend her own reputation, but also to stand as a symbol of the many voices that had long been silenced by prejudice. As the trial proceeded, it became clear that the stage was set for a confrontation that would go far beyond personal grievances. It was a test of the very principles upon which justice was supposed to stand, a test that would soon challenge every assumption about authority and fairness in Northbridge. As the trial progressed, Officer Malone continued his testimony with unwavering certainty, insisting that his version of events was the only truth. "I observed the protest from the street," he declared, his voice resonating with authority. Yet, the details of his account began to show cracks when cross-examined by Marcia's attorney. When asked to explain the timeline of events, Malone's recollections conflicted with established records. His description of the incident appeared rehearsed, with gaps that suggested he had either forgotten crucial details or deliberately omitted facts. Marcia, seated calmly in the witness box, listened intently. Her eyes were steady, and she allowed her attorney to ask the questions without interruption. The courtroom buzzed with quiet energy as the discrepancies in Malone's testimony came to light. Whispers spread among the spectators. Colleagues, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike began to question the validity of his account. Was Officer Malone truly reporting an incident of public disorder, or was he simply projecting his personal biases onto an innocent event? As the cross-examination deepened, the tension in the courtroom escalated. Marcia's attorney pressed Malone on the specifics of his observation, highlighting the contradictions between his statement and the technical logs provided by the department's surveillance system. Each pointed question exposed further inconsistencies. The officer's confident tone faltered ever so slightly, and a few moments of silence followed responses that did not match the facts on record. In the gallery, a young legal intern whispered to a fellow attendee, "It looks like he is lying under oath." The murmurs grew louder, and soon several members of the public began to express their disbelief at the unfolding revelations. The courtroom, once filled with an expectation of routine procedure, was now a stage where the credibility of a long-serving officer was being dismantled piece by piece. The presiding judge, a man known for his calm yet decisive manner, listened intently. He ordered a brief recess so that all parties could review the evidence anew. During this pause, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Legal experts in the room discussed the inconsistencies in hushed tones, and some even speculated about the possibility of disciplinary action against Officer Malone for his earlier actions. The evidence was mounting against him, and it was becoming clear that his testimony was not as infallible as he had presumed. When the court reconvened, the tension reached a new peak. Officer Malone was asked directly to explain the discrepancies in his account, and his answers grew increasingly defensive. His earlier confidence was replaced by a sense of desperation as he struggled to reconcile the conflicting details of his story. Meanwhile, Marcia Ellis maintained her quiet dignity, her calm serving as a stark contrast to the officer's agitated state. Every question she did not answer herself added to the weight of suspicion against Malone. By the end of the conflict build-up, it was apparent to everyone present that the officer's testimony was marred by dishonesty. The mounting evidence, both technical and testimonial, suggested that Officer Malone had not only misrepresented the events of that night, but had done so in a way that exposed deep-seated biases. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation. The truth was slowly emerging, and it was only a matter of time before the full extent of Malone's misconduct was revealed. The stage was set for a dramatic shift in the power dynamic, one that would force the entire department to confront its own failings. As the trial moved into its next phase, the air in the courtroom became charged with a sense of impending change. Officer Malone's earlier confident assertions had begun to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. With every question posed by Marsh's attorney, his story unraveled further. The technical logs that he had presented as proof now seemed more like carefully constructed fabrications than genuine records of events. A young reporter in the gallery, who had been diligently taking notes throughout the proceedings, suddenly received a tip from an internal source. The reporter quickly shared that additional records from the department's security system would soon be introduced into evidence. Records that confirmed several prior incidents in which Officer Malone had been disciplined for overstepping his bounds. When these details were mentioned during a brief recess, the murmurs in the courtroom turned into a chorus of disbelief. Whispers grew louder as legal experts and community members exchanged looks of shock and concern. At this critical moment, the tension escalated dramatically. The presiding judge, sensing that the integrity of the trial was at stake, ordered a temporary adjournment so that the new evidence could be reviewed in detail. During this break, the atmosphere in the room transformed from one of tentative skepticism to a full-blown demand for accountability. Officers who had previously remained silent now began to murmur their own doubts about Malone's credibility. Even some of his longtime colleagues appeared visibly uneasy as the additional evidence cast a long shadow over his testimony. When the court reconvened, the mood had shifted irreversibly. The new records were introduced, and they painted a damning picture of Officer Malone's history of bias. The technical logs showed not only discrepancies in his account of the events on the night in question, but also patterns of behavior that pointed to repeated violations of departmental protocols. The courtroom, once dominated by the officer's authoritative tone, now resonated with a collective outcry for truth. Before long, the doors to the courtroom opened once again, and several additional officers entered the room. Among them was Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, a man widely respected for his fairness and his commitment to upholding the principles of justice. Lieutenant Daniels had been summoned by higher command after receiving multiple complaints about Officer Malone's conduct. His arrival was a turning point. As he stepped forward, his calm, measured presence immediately silenced the murmurs and refocused attention on the proceedings. Officer Malone, now visibly rattled by the arrival of Lieutenant Daniels and the mounting evidence against him, tried to salvage his credibility. "I have served this community with honor for many years," he insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. However, his words were met with skeptical stares from both the judge and the courtroom audience. Lieutenant Daniels approached the bench and, after a brief but pointed exchange with the presiding judge, announced that the case would undergo a comprehensive review. This decision effectively suspended Officer Malone's authority regarding his testimony and cast a long shadow over his previous statements. The courtroom was now alive with energy. Legal experts nodded in agreement as Lieutenant Daniels methodically explained the next steps of the review process. "We must examine every detail of this case," he stated firmly. "When our own records reveal discrepancies, it is our duty to question every assertion." His words resonated with everyone present, and a sense of unity emerged among those who had long championed accountability and fairness in law enforcement. Throughout this phase, every moment felt critical. The focus was not just on the specific incident, but on the broader implications of unchecked authority. Colleagues, media representatives, and even members of the public were now discussing the need for reform within the department. "This is not just about one officer," one observer remarked. "It is about a system that has allowed personal bias to masquerade as professional judgment for too long." As the internal review continued, Lieutenant Daniels called for additional testimonies from other officers who had witnessed Officer Malone's previous infractions. Their statements, delivered in quiet, measured tones, confirmed that Malone had a history of letting personal prejudice influence his actions. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from one of defensive protest to a collective resolve to demand transparency and justice. Every new piece of evidence, every corroborative testimony, added to the growing consensus that change was not only necessary, it was imminent. In the midst of this rising tension, Rosa, who had been observing the proceedings with quiet determination, began to receive nods of support from fellow community members and legal experts alike. Her calm, factual approach to the case had slowly eroded the credibility of Officer Malone, and the courtroom was now leaning decisively in her favor. The power dynamics had shifted. The once unassailable officer was now under intense scrutiny, and the truth was emerging in a way that no one had anticipated. By the time Lieutenant Daniels concluded the review session for the day, the mood in the room had transformed entirely. What had begun as a disputed testimony had evolved into a public demand for reform, a call for an honest evaluation of authority in a system that could no longer tolerate hidden bias. The rising tension had reached its peak, and everyone present could sense that they were witnessing a watershed moment in the history of the department. The defining moment arrived on a brisk afternoon when the courtroom reconvened for the final arguments. The air was heavy with anticipation as Lieutenant Daniels took the stand once more. With a calm and authoritative voice, he addressed the entire courtroom. After a thorough review of all the evidence and testimony, it is clear that Officer Malone has not only misrepresented the facts under oath, but his actions have repeatedly violated the trust placed in him by this community. A hush fell over the room as Lieutenant Daniels continued. Based on the overwhelming evidence, you are hereby relieved of your duties in this matter, and an internal investigation will be launched to address your conduct. The statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Officer Malone stood frozen, his earlier defiance replaced by a look of disbelief and mounting regret. In that single moment, the entire power structure in the room shifted dramatically. Seizing this opportunity for final justice, Marcia Ellis, who had been an unwavering beacon of calm throughout the trial, rose from her seat. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the room as she declared, "I stand here not as a defendant, but as a defender of truth and justice. I have always believed that every person deserves to be treated fairly, and I will not allow prejudice to dictate the law." Her words, delivered with genuine passion, resonated deeply with every member of the audience. The turning point was sealed when the judge, after listening intently to Lieutenant Daniels and the compelling evidence presented, announced his verdict. In light of the extensive evidence, and in the interest of upholding the integrity of our justice system, I dismiss the charges against Ms. Ellis. Furthermore, I order an immediate review of departmental practices to ensure that such misconduct does not occur again. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of approval and relief. The verdict was a resounding affirmation of the principles of fairness and accountability. At that moment, Officer Malone, stripped of his authority and faced with the undeniable truth of his actions, could only stand in silence. The judge's words had not only exonerated Marcia, but had also sent a powerful message. No one is above the law, and the system must be held accountable for every injustice. The shock on Malone's face was mirrored by a collective sense of vindication among those present. The turning point had transformed the courtroom from a battleground of personal vendettas into a forum for systemic change. In that charged climax, the power dynamic had been completely reversed. The racist officer who had once abused his position was now the subject of scrutiny, and his downfall served as a catalyst for a broader call for reform. The verdict, unexpected and unyielding, shocked the entire courtroom and promised a new era of accountability, a moment when truth and justice would finally prevail over prejudice. In the days following the judge's verdict, the atmosphere in Northbridge underwent a subtle but profound transformation. News of Officer Malone's removal and the judge's resounding decision spread quickly through the community. Local media outlets covered the story extensively, and public sentiment shifted in favor of transparency and reform. The case had become a symbol of hope for those who believed that justice could overcome even the deepest-seated biases. Marcia Ellis returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. Her unwavering stand in court had not only exonerated her, but had also inspired a wave of support from community leaders and civil rights advocates. She was invited to speak at town hall meetings and legal panels, where she shared her experience and called for meaningful reforms within the police department. Her transformation from a target of injustice to a champion of accountability resonated deeply with many who had long fought for equality. Lieutenant Marcus Daniels wasted no time in implementing changes. Over the next few weeks, he organized a comprehensive review of the department's practices and introduced new training programs aimed at addressing cultural sensitivity and recognizing personal biases. The reforms were designed to prevent future incidents of misconduct and to ensure that every officer was held accountable for their actions. Daniels' leadership, marked by both firmness and compassion, promised a fresh start for Northbridge Police, a new path built on fairness and respect for all citizens. Officer Malone, now on administrative leave pending a full internal investigation, was left to confront the consequences of his actions. In a series of interviews that followed, he expressed regret over his conduct and acknowledged that his views had clouded his judgment. While his future on the force remained uncertain, his case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one was above scrutiny, no matter how long they had served. The community of Northbridge, once divided by suspicion and fear, began to come together in the spirit of renewal. Local organizations organized public forums where citizens could voice their concerns and demand ongoing accountability from law enforcement. The courthouse, which had been the setting for such dramatic conflict, took on new significance as a symbol of the community's commitment to justice. At a final town hall meeting held at Northbridge Municipal Courthouse, Lieutenant Daniels addressed the gathered crowd. "Today, we have witnessed a pivotal moment in our community," he declared. "We have seen that when we demand accountability, even those who have long held power can be challenged. Let this be the beginning of a future where every individual is treated with fairness and respect." His words were met with a round of applause that echoed through the historic halls. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcia Ellis stood alongside Lieutenant Daniels, both symbols of a new era. The courtroom drama had evolved into a broader movement for reform, one that promised to reshape not only the police department, but the entire community of Northbridge. In the aftermath, the legacy of this case would serve as a constant reminder that even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, the truth could prevail. Northbridge emerged stronger and more united. The painful lessons of the past gave way to a commitment to continuous improvement and the belief that justice was not a static ideal, but an ongoing journey. In that spirit, the community vowed to remain vigilant and to hold their leaders accountable, ensuring that every voice would be heard and every injustice addressed. The final chapter of this saga was written not in the shadows of conflict, but in the bright light of accountability and reform. Northbridge, now a beacon of hope and progress, set an example for other communities struggling with similar issues. The judge's verdict had shocked the entire courtroom and the entire city, and in doing so, it had paved the way for a future where truth and justice were more than just words, but living principles that guided every action.